We're going to move on to answering some of the questions that we've received, and some of them have already been answered during the discussion, and answers that have been posted that hopefully you can see. Let's begin with one question about whether who or what might be seen in changes to healthcare room ventilation standards. Are there any expectations of new standards internationally in the U.S., etc.? For example, maybe Amanda or Andy, are you aware of any discussions about new standards for healthcare room ventilation standard changes?
This is Amanda. There are not, within the AME working groups, there are not currently changes underway. However, we will be bringing the groups, the responsible working groups, this would probably fall under our hospital steam sterilization practices, the same group that developed AME Pt.7, to review and determine whether there's a need to develop anything in the interim or make any changes.
Elliot, I can provide a little bit of information. The only country that I'm aware of, or group of countries that I'm aware of, that have advanced more rigorous standards of care around airborne contamination are Sweden and the Netherlands, and those standards apply specifically to the operating room, where they have placed limitations on colony forming units. But I'm not aware of anything moving forward more broadly for healthcare spaces.
Okay, thank you. Another question we have is related to spraying passengers and airline passengers before landing in some countries, and what the various pros and cons or risks, whether that's recommended, whether it's futile, any evidence or information about that?
This is Ruth. I know that a number of the airlines are looking at really increasing attention to environmental cleaning and disinfection, not so much because we have evidence of transmission, but it's more as it is related to public expectation. So we are seeing more embracing of electrostatic sprayers of disinfectants on airplanes. But I think it's always a reminder that we have to clean before we disinfect. So we should not be seeing just simply electrostatic spraying. And the guidelines that airlines have been using are to spray only when the airplanes are empty. So I wonder that they don't use the same approach if they are spraying for insects. So I'm wondering if maybe some of the discussion about spraying involves insects instead of for COVID, but we very, very well could be seeing some kind of doing their own thing, but I don't think that's going to be part of the standard approach for airlines.
And I'll just add that the spraying of people, which is in the question, that is not what we're talking about here. That should not be done.
I think it is done. I've been on plane bread for entering some countries. So if you look on WHO, there's an insecticide that they do use. So for the Zika and virus infections, that's we've been sprayed. So you'll see there's a list of all the countries that they're required, and it does come through WHO. I think that's what they're referring to. But Ruth, you're right. I mean, that would be the next thing that they would think that they could start spraying a disinfectant, in an airline. I think they're all doing that after the planes when they clean.
Yeah, this is an important issue that has to be clarified in the literature, because there is a lot of misinformation about the potential safety of using disinfectants, whether it's dilute chlorine that some people are taking orally, or other sprays, and there are great dangers with those.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think your point is, this is a disease where the entire world is focused. And so we are seeing things emerging rapidly. We are seeing research that is being done, some good, some bad, as with all research. But it's going to be very important that groups like WHO and CDC and all of the components of WHO around the world really look at this and try to figure out what makes sense but the research is not going to stop, and it shouldn't.
Right.
How we use it is the challenge.
Another controversial topic is the safety of various homemade masks and the use of cloth, and also the diffusion of counterfeit masks that look like N95 or KN95 or medical masks. Any either common sense guidance. I mean, it's easy to say look up the manufacturer in a list, but I can tell you it's not that easy. And often what you order is not what you receive. I'm sending back a box of 100 items like that today. So any guidance, any perspectives for where we get that information? Because there has been a sort of a spate of articles in the press and elsewhere that, well, almost any old thing could be used.
I think it's context. And you know, ECRI has some resources that you can see on our resource center site that addresses homemade masks. And the reality is if what you're talking about is a healthcare worker who's actually trying to prevent, you know, viral transmission, you know, that's different. So, you know, wearing a bandana is not going to prevent that. But if you're walking in the supermarket, having some protective barrier, if you will, should limit some of those droplets, you know, that were being discussed earlier. And I think this becomes just that pivotal conversation, and I really appreciate what Maureen was speaking to, because if the world thinks this is all airborne and it's, you know, going to spread that way, then there could be this panic that everybody needs to have, you know, an N95. And quite honestly, they're still in short supply to our healthcare workers. Like you said, Elliot, there's counterfeits out there. So we can't even preserve that supply when it's there. And so it's this revolving cycle. And I mean, ECRI is working as fast as we can to test some of these masks and really get that information out there. But it's almost as soon as, you know, you kind of test one, a new supplier enters the market. And so there's a whole, you know, another batch to test.
Right, and there's been guidance that people with chronic diseases or immunosuppressed situations should be looking for KN95 or higher quality masks than just fabric. But it's pretty hard to expect those folks to figure out what they can and can't buy. Maybe a collaboration with Consumers Union and AARP might be helpful for ECRI to explore to help promulgate better information. Another question we have is limitations of soap and water for decontaminating PPE. Anyone want to comment on soap and water versus dilute bleach versus alcohol as a methodology?
I think I'll follow kind of what Andy said about its context. If you're in if you're in public and you're outside of healthcare, use a face cloth and then just clean that as you normally would any other item. Just wash it like you do your clothes, or if you want to wash it in the sink, or if you have a bucket or whatever, you know, wash that like you normally would. If you're looking at personal protective equipment, then that is very problematic because, you know, excessive moisture can degrade the item. And there have been a number of studies that have been done out of the NIOSH personal protection labs that have looked at, you know, what can you microwave? What can you spray with bleach? But we all know that over time it degrades not only the product of the filter that you're going to breathe through, but equally as importantly, it degrades the straps. So you do have to be careful, and it's not just any old disinfectant will do. It's just like trying to disinfect a cloth item, a chair or a couch. If it absorbs the disinfectant solution, then it's problematic. It does not have that desired kill effect. So we don't want homemade remedies doing this, and I think this is one reason why we're seeing a lot of push to wear face shields. If you can shield the item from being contaminated, then that may prolong the life, and then you can certainly wipe off or disinfect, you know, a face shield.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, if an N95 is visibly contaminated, using UV, using, you know, vaporized hydrogen peroxide, that doesn't work. You know, that mask should be thrown away. And I keep using mask and respirator interchangeably, just because, you know, you kind of see it in the press and the world, and I just don't want to, you know, not be scientific, but at the same token, kind of speak to everybody. And so just from my perspective, it's exactly what Ruth just said. Everything's contextual, and if something looks visibly dirty, that's move on to the next one or think of something else. And the evidence, it's not clear, but you know, yes, the shield can work, and also putting, you know, another coating like a surgical mask, if you have them more in abundant supply, that over top of the N95, that too can extend the life if there is going to be something that you know, contacts it. There was some worry about whether or not that might make healthcare providers dizzy or lightheaded, but the evidence is not very clear on that.
Okay, on a practical note, is there a reasonable way for LMIC situations to validate whatever processes they're using for essentially reuse of PPE? Do you have any methodologies? Can you point to any methodologies? Might you work together to create methodologies? I mean, it's a real challenge that's going on for 20 years, talking about validation of reuse of single-use technologies. And people don't have their own labs to do their own studies.
You know, I think this is almost like an Amanda comment as well, because this is one reason why we rely on standard setting organization that will say something like, you know, use of Spalding classification to give you a guidance on how to address different pieces of equipment or items. That we're not going to be able to perform a study to test every single process. So what is our framework for making that type of decision? And I think it goes back to, if it's dirty, it's a risk. Now you decide how much risk. Then we know we're going to have situations where we simply have nothing to use. In those situations, would I wear something that might be visibly soiled? If that's all I've got, then I probably would. What might I do? I don't know, maybe I'll leave it out in the sun to have a little bit of, in hopes that, you know, the ozone layer is just fractured enough that I might get a little bit of that germicidal radiation through. But, you know, we do the best we can with the resources that we have, but we have to have a thought process behind it.
Well, Kathy and I were involved in Amy's early work in single-use reprocessing, single-use product reprocessing, and it boiled down to, if you reprocess, you become the manufacturer and you're responsible for validation. It's a bit of a chicken and an egg, and a lot of hospitals and companies dropped out of that when it boiled down to registering as a manufacturer and taking on the liability and risk. But as a practical issue, virtually everyone is reusing everywhere PPE. There is not sufficient supply in the supply chain. Perhaps we are at a point where we might discuss creating a Gartner hype cycle kind of chart that indicates things that are promising, things that are invalid, things that shouldn't be used, so that not just for processes, but also for products. And I don't know what everyone's thoughts are about that, and we don't have time to talk about it. But I think this is a discussion perhaps that ECRI and Amy and CED and others might talk about in terms of having collaborative discussions that would create some kind of a graphic way of figuring out where are you on the kind of the risk and probability and newness, uncertainty, which has really been the hallmark of the hype cycle. And the reality of the hype cycle is also based on the uptake of new technology and innovation and the valley of death where new products die, but we don't have the time to wait 2 years for new products to be validated. So we are really in perhaps we're in an agile framework or time. I think we have sort of run to the end of our time, and we've answered most of the questions that we have teed up. Kathy and I, really appreciate the time that all of you have spent in this presentation. I'll turn it over to Kathy for some closing comments in a moment. I think that this is invaluable for the whole global community to have access to this information. For everyone who is watching, we will be sharing artifacts for the next several weeks. We will post all of the information. If you have additional questions, we invite them, and we will try to get those answers to you. Kathy, any thoughts?
Elliot, I just wanted to say once again how much we appreciate the opportunity to participate and integrate infection prevention into the engineering conversation. And in addition to providing some valuable resources, I think we've also teed up some very important questions that we could potentially help answer moving forward as we address this challenge.
Excellent. Thank you all. Thank IFMBE CD for providing these resources, and look forward to having additional webinars and solving some of these issues, because they're really near and dear to everyone's heart. We're all saving our own families' lives, our own communities. We love our children, we love our parents, we want to do the right thing for our nations. So everyone be safe, and we'll see you in another webinar soon. Thank you again, everybody.
Thank you.